Hey everybody, it's SD. Welcome to the Meaningful Messy podcast again. This is episode number 4, I believe, or 5, yeah. So I'm really excited to talk about one of the things I love to talk about, which is emotions. This episode will be talking about a lot of self-compassion and having approval for all of our emotional spaces that we find ourselves in life. I can say that learning these skills that I'm going to talk about has changed my life, like in a way that nothing else has. I would say that learning to cultivate radical self compassion, self acceptance, having just a lot of compassion and kindness for my emotional states and the places that I'm in has completely shifted how I approach life, how I approach the world, how I internalize the world and deal with anything in life. So I'm going to be talking about the tools that have changed me for the better. I have always been a very emotional person. I've been emotional since I was young. I have been very intuitive, deep feeling. And when I was an early teen, I began to have a lot of emotional issues, anxiety, sadness. Always been a little prone to depression, kind of caretaking, taking on people's stuff a little bit more than I should. I have borderline personality disorder. So that is characterized by extreme bouts of emotion. So I may feel emotion a little bit stronger than the average person due to the way my brain functions, the chemicals in my brain, just a little bit on the extreme end. I love extremes, but I can just take things a little bit rough. Like if I'm really low, something happens, I can be really low. If something is really fun and exciting, I can get really high because my dopamine loves that. When I am angry about something, my anger has always had, quite a short fuse. And that's one of the biggest shifts that I started with, was really learning to work with this anger and recognize it and start to have compassion for it. A lot of the time with borderline personality, we tend to be a little more prone to anger, rage, acting impulsively on that kind of anger. Even from a young age, from when I was like a preteen, and I was dealing with things, I, went through things where I would be angry. I would kick the wall. I would punch the wall. I was just like very prone to just kind of losing it and acting aggressively. So this was always something that I knew about myself, and I wouldn't really understand why it was that way all the time. I just assumed I was just like upset because of things happening at school or whatever it was. But usually the person closest to me, like, it would, whether it was like my mom or my partners, they would see the full brunt of that. Like when I was truly upset and I would kind of lose that self-regulation, and I would just, something would make me mad. I would go from 0 to 100 and just be extremely upset and distraught. And I kind of didn't understand that as a teenager. I was just like, oh, well, I guess I am a little crazy sometimes and I don't understand, but it doesn't necessarily go away simply because we get older, right? So I've seen this come out more in my adult life. I think that I would always feel a lot of shame about my anger. And romantic relationships are where, a lot of my borderline like symptoms and characteristics tend to be activated and heightened, especially if I am triggered by particular things. So that's, like I said, the person closest to me gets to see it all. Lucky them. But yeah, no, it's been a huge part of my life, and learning to really understand and work with it has been very necessary and has helped me change the course of my life. So I used to just have a lot of shame about it and not really want to look at it and not really want to go there and just be like, I don't know, I guess I just get angry, right? I internalized that shame. I would internalize the shame, and I would like tell myself on some level, oh, you're a bad person, SD, because you blow up. Why do you blow up? And then my partner would see it, and I would just be like, I'm sorry, I just kind of lost it. And, they would kind of say like, like you're scary when you're mad. And it's kind of been a joke, not really a joke amongst like my partners and my friends are like, oh, ST's like a little scary, you know, and a lot of people are surprised by that too, because I can be, you know, bubbly and happy go lucky and kind of, you know, seem pretty calm. You know, I've heard the feedback from people I've heard it several times when I've talked about my mental health issues. People who are like either longtime friends or newer friends or acquaintances, they'll say, oh, you really seem like you have your stuff together. Like, it's hard for me to picture you that way. And I always just kind of laugh inside. And my partners have laughed. They're just like, you have not seen her. So it's just funny how the perception, you know, and that people have versus the reality. And it's not that, you know, I'm not regulated and being authentic, and I do have a calmness, but I think I've cultivated that because I have swung so far on the other end of things that I've learned to implement those things, while at the same time still being authentic and not trying to act like those parts of me don't exist, because they do exist. I've just really had to learn to look at it. You know, so I had a lot of shame about my anger and didn't really know, you know, how to address it, you know. So I started a lot of therapy, and the first time as an adult, again, I've been in and out of therapy since I was 13, but I remember really starting to do self-compassion work. There's a work called internal family systems where you work with your child parts, like the different parts of yourself within you, and you kind of spend time with those parts and you ask them questions and you go back to the first time you felt rejected or you really felt this, and you try, your therapist will guide you and kind of take you back to places and try to have you embody and work with, you know, somatically, like have an experience of you're embodying that time period, you're embodying that experience again and working with it. And that really was instrumental in learning self-compassion, really just spending time, because a lot of the time our child part versus our adult self that we are now, we have all these different parts, are not necessarily on the same page and they're not communicating. So a lot of the time when we're acting out as an adult, there's some unmet need within us. And I think there's more psychology to this. There's a lot of ways to approach this and a lot of tools. I do think learning to work with the inner child and really ask questions to them and witness them is hugely instrumental. So it's one of the great tools. So that was called IFS therapy. That's when I really started to learn self-compassion and witness. And, you know, I used to feel so much guilt about my anger. And whenever I would work with my anger with a therapist, I would always go to, you know, where's this angry part of me? And it was always my teenage self, you know, my 13, 14-year-old, like angsty teenager. I would always say I feel really in touch with my angsty teenager, you know, the girl who was bullied, the girl who felt like an outcast at school and, you know, felt picked on and never really learned to speak up for herself, never spoke up for herself. And, you know, that's the part I've always been in touch with, where, you know, I'm just like, she's angry. That teenage Esty is angry, and she wanted to be defended. She wanted to feel defended. She wanted to speak up. She wanted to be treated well. She didn't want to be treated that way. And I think that I didn't have those tools as a teenager. And so I just internalized that. And, you know, the anger, pardon me, the anger just found ways to come out. And that's just kind of been there. Because I know now, even as an adult, even with all the work I've done, like one of my biggest triggers for that is feeling bullied or mistreated, or like somebody is provoking me without cause, or whatever the situation is. But that is one of my biggest triggers, where that anger will arise, and it feels like that teenager, that, you know, wronged teenager comes up and wants vengeance, and it's like, hey, I'm not gonna let this person talk to me that way anymore. Like, I don't take that anymore. And so I understand, right? There's the experience of understanding, okay, this emotion, I can witness the emotion, I can notice it, you know, give it space. I can intellectually, emotionally understand where it's rooted in, where it's coming from, right? So there's all of those things that, like, things like therapy can help you with. Then there's the experience of like being with that emotion. I think when we first encounter it and it comes up, we are immediately like, I shouldn't feel this. This is bad. This is wrong. This is inappropriate. I can't feel this emotion because I can't be this kind of person, or I can't be an angry person. I know applies to a lot of emotions, but anger in particular, we tend to not want to give space to. We don't want to look at it because it's ugly, it's scary, and we just want to shove it aside, and we want to push it down, and we want to pretend it's not there. And I think that learning to first take that first step and witness it and just be with it and say, okay, I feel angry right now. I wonder what's happening for me. And just kind of take that moment to notice it and to bring mindfulness to it and to say, like, okay, I'm going to use the tools that I've cultivated now. I'm going to look at what's underneath this anger. What's the trigger? What's the cause? And then just kind of take a breath. And there's a way that you can overtly say to yourself, or just subconsciously tell yourself, it's okay that I feel this way. It's okay. This feeling is welcome. It may not be accurate to the situation. It may not be permanent or necessarily true. But I'm going to allow this emotion to exist right now because it's real and it's here. And I'm going to give it space. And then from there, that's the first step. And from there, you can work with it. Because you've already told your mind, your heart, your nervous system, hey, like, I'm feeling something, and you're not making yourself wrong for it. You're immediately going to the place of, I'm going to greet this with compassion, first of all. I'll deal with it, and I'll work with it later. But I'm going to first welcome it and say, hey, it's okay that you're here. You're here for a reason. We're going to get to the bottom of this. But that initial pushing away of an uncomfortable emotion is where we can shortchange ourselves, and we can, cut off the authenticity that can exist. We can just stop the authenticity in its tracks, and we can say, hey, I'm going to face the reality of what's happening for myself, and I'm going to be with it, and I'm going to welcome it so that I can actually work with that reality, and it can change, and I can grow in this area. So I think the first step is offering that witnessing and compassion, just noticing yourself. I like to think of myself as, here's my mind, and I'm standing outside my mind, and I'm looking down, and I'm just in observer mode, seeing what's happening. And I think there's a lot of tools you can use. I highly recommend IFS therapy. I highly recommend regularly having someone witness, these parts of yourself. I think just talking them out with somebody and allowing them to be and exist for what they are. Because the reality is, like, we have a world inside of us that is just true. We may not necessarily love everything we feel, everything we think, our deepest, darkest, rawest parts of ourselves that are just like ugly. And we kind of have those fears that, like, man, if the people in my life knew what was really in here, would they really want to be around me? And the reality is, we're all human beings, and so many of us all of us experience those things, and whether we want to divulge that or not, and it's not always necessarily the thing to divulge every part of that to everyone in our life. There's appropriate places to do it. But when we can start with that extreme just self-compassion and that extreme self-honesty, like just really getting to the root of, like, hey, this is real for me. This is part of who I am. And this belief system, these judgments, these thoughts, these feelings, they exist in me for a reason. And instead of judging them and pushing them away, I'm going to be curious about them. So I highly recommend starting to view yourself in this way and starting to give your emotions that airtime. So anger was huge for me. I think once I started to work with it, I started to not be afraid of it. I wasn't afraid of, like, oh, I see, like, angry Esty coming out. Like, it started to be kind of, like, endearing after a while when I would get angry, because for my first few years in my kind of healing journey, like, my anger didn't show up a lot anymore. I was just like, interesting that I'm not feeling that, or it would come up and I would be really kind of playful and curious about it. In the last couple of years with, like, different things I've faced, different relationship struggles, because relationships are my number one trigger. More on that later, but I have had a lot of it come back up, like a lot of my, like, deeper, darker emotions and anger and frustration, and working with that distress has really taught me so much, because there's all kinds of tools we can use to self-regulate once we've acknowledged and accepted that the emotion's there. Pardon me, I'm burping. We can use self-regulation tools, and we can intellectually understand it. And I think that like a combination of all of those things can really help turn your life around, because once we're able to fully accept the reality of who we are, like the full realness, the rawness, no filter, just accept what's there, you can go anywhere. You can truly, like, what do you have to be afraid of? I mean, it's one of the most courageous things you can do, is to look at the reality of yourself and say, hey, this is part of who I am. This is part of my journey. And what if I'm not wrong for any of these emotions, any of these thoughts? I want to make a distinction that there's a quote I love that says, every emotion is valid, not every emotion is accurate, or every emotion is true, right? So it doesn't mean that because we are feeling a certain way, we're feeling wronged, we're feeling rejected, we're feeling disappointed. It doesn't mean that that experience is actually accurate in reality. It doesn't mean that that's actually what's happening to us. It just means that we have that trigger and those feelings coming up for us in that way for a particular reason. And we can witness them, we can be with them. So recognizing that is extremely important for growth, is recognizing I may feel a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And that keeps us in self-reflection mode and keeps us from projecting a lot of our bullshit onto other people. Because when we don't self-reflect, we will just project that shit onto everyone around us and say, this is what's happening to me, and we believe everything that our brain tells us. And learning that has been extremely necessary for me as someone with, you know, the mental health struggles that I have, is learning that like my brain is not always telling me the truth. You know, my brain has protective mechanisms and conditioning and years of neural pathways that have been formed from experiences I've had. And my brain reacts still sometimes. I'm far less reactive than I used to be, but I still will react to certain things, certain triggers. Like I said, one of my biggest triggers for my anger is feeling like I'm being backed into a corner, feeling like I'm being picked on in some way and I'm not really defending myself, or if I feel like I'm being treated unfairly. I know that that will create a nervous system response in myself. In romantic relationships, it's a lot of different things. You know, if I feel like emotionally abandoned, or like my partner wants to leave in conflict and not handle things or talk about things, like my abandonment wound becomes activated and I have a nervous system response. But what I've learned, you know, like 10 years ago, I would have those responses and I would just fly off the handle and I would react, and I would physically react. I would emotionally, verbally react and just be explosive. And now I'm not going to say I'm never explosive anymore. I'm never reactive, right? I'm a human being. I'm going to be, but I can sit and notice what's happening. Like I always say that I understand my triggers extremely well. It is something that I don't want to sound full of myself, but it is something I consider one of my biggest strengths, because I have worked with this stuff so much. And that's what I always joke about with my friends with, is I am crazy. That's why I understand these things so well. And, you know, I joke about the word crazy, but it's like, you know, I acknowledge that I have been unhinged in my life, and I have reacted, and I have blown up and had many disproportional reactions to the situation. A situation happens, I react to it way disproportionately to what actually happened. And I acknowledge that those things have happened. And now, you know, I'm aware of when those things are happening. I'm aware of my triggers. I'm aware of what I'm doing, and I have more choice. And I can say, hey, you can be with this emotion. It's okay that it's still happening. How do you want to react? Do you want to sit with it? Do you want to work on some self-regulation and then come back to it? Do you want to just name it out loud and say what it is? Do I need to take space from the situation? So I have all of those tools that I can do when the emotion is there and after the fact, right? But really learning to understand your triggers is life-changing. If you can get to the point where you're like, I know what kind of things will activate and trigger me, and I know that when this particular situation happens and a particular person comes around and says a particular thing, I know that my nervous system's going to go into heightened mode, and I'm going to feel a rush of sadness. I may even feel like physical sensations or pain or panic or whatever that is. And then my brain may start to tell me, this person's rejecting you, or this situation is going badly and you're not welcome here, or whatever it is. If you can understand those things about yourself and work with them, then when you get into those situations, you will not be a victim. You will not be paralyzed. You will not be reactive and unable to approach the situation differently. You can approach the situation more empowered, how you want to, because you understand yourself. And when you understand yourself, you have a lot of power. It's extremely beneficial to understand yourself, and you don't have to be perfect, and you don't have to always, keep it together and regulate and be, on top of the mountain, mindfulness, meditation, woo woo, whatever. I have moments like that, and I have moments where, I'm the complete opposite, and I, say, hey, I messed up and I blew up, and I know that I was being irrational, and it happened, and it happens, it still happens. I'm 35 now, and it happens at times, especially in the romantic realm. That's where my, my most sensitivity is. So I think that really learning those tools, and first and foremost, understanding yourself, being willing to have compassion for whatever you're feeling, whether it's, if you struggle with accepting your anger, if you struggle with accepting your, mental health struggles, sadness, it's not necessarily super socially acceptable. It's taboo to, to feel depressed and to say, hey, like, I've been in bed for a day, or, I haven't done my laundry all week because my executive function is down and I can't function right now. I'm very sad. It's those kind of things are all the ways that we can feel shame about our lives and ourselves, having anxiety, just the things that we struggle with, and being able to offer compassion to those areas, to ourselves first, and then allowing other people to offer compassion there too. But we have to be able to provide that for ourselves first. And then, you may even start to notice that, like, oh, like, I fully accept this about myself. Like, it is what it is. Like, other people, you'll see that other people will be inspired by that authenticity themselves, because in reality, all of us want to be accepted, loved. We want permission to feel like we can, be accepted as we are, even in our darkest parts. And when somebody is seeing that somebody has that approval for themselves, they feel more permission for that for themselves. So you can help other people be more authentic. You can bring that permission into the rooms you're in and say, hey, like, it's okay. We're human. Sometimes we mess up. Cut through that weird knife of tension that, like, oh, we all have to act like we have it together and we're perfect. And once you realize that you are inviting that into your life, it's like a breath of fresh air. You will just be like, okay, I'm not fighting against my reality. I'm not fighting against myself, against my brain, my heart, and these things. I'm fully in compassion for myself, accepting myself, and I'm going to work with the things that I struggle with. And, really, like, who can harm you in that place, right? Like, people are going to have the judgments they're going to have, and people aren't always going to accept your fullness. They're not going to be able to accept you the way you have learned to accept yourself, because a lot of the time it's because they have not learned that acceptance for themselves. They are uncomfortable with it because you are illuminating something for them that they have not addressed within themselves. So they're not going to be comfortable. It doesn't matter. You can have compassion for that too, for their inability to be with you and to understand you. You can have compassion for that, because the reality is it takes a lot of work to really be with that. It is not the easiest work, and some people don't want to go down the path of, like, learning to love and accept all of their parts. It's not pretty all the time. It's hard, and it's worthwhile. I always say, like, I have done it my whole life because I've just always naturally leaned towards that because of how much intensity I've felt my whole life, and I want to understand it and work with it. And now that I have those tools, my life isn't so intense all the time. It's more neutral. Like, I'm like, okay, yeah, you're feeling that. That's cool. So it's like when you start having those judgments on your darker emotions, you can be playful. You can say, hey, yeah, I'm pissed off. Or, hey, I handled that irrationally. And you can bring a levity to your life. So you're not bottled up. You're not tight. You're not living behind a mask. And that's a powerful place to be. So, yeah, there's many emotions, whether it's anger, sadness, jealousy, rage, envy, jealousy, envy. Those are another thing we tend to not have approval for because we feel shame for it. We feel embarrassed. We feel like, oh, I'm a bad person for feeling this way, or I shouldn't feel this way, or we do the kind of like the lying to ourselves, like I'm really not jealous of that person or that thing, in reality. It's like we could be curious about it and say, that's interesting that I feel that way. I wonder what's behind this. Is this envy because I want more of that person has? I want to be more that way. I want the freedom that I see that they have. I want more of this in my life. And sometimes, it's easier to want to project that out when in reality, we can just deal with what's inside of us. I think that learning to not project onto other people and to start viewing every projection as information. Like, hey, am I projecting my judgments on other people because of how I feel about myself? I think once you can start recognizing those things, you can work with them and you can begin to understand yourself and other people and connect with yourself and other people in a way you never have before. So start trying these things the next time you're experiencing some hard shit, just like sit and work with those emotions, sit and witness it and ask yourself, what if it's not wrong to feel this way? What if it's not wrong to be having this experience? There's something called a loving kindness meditation. There's a lot of tools. There's like yogic tools. There's a lot of writing tools. You could look up just like self-compassion techniques and tools and just start to incorporate that into your life regularly and see how your life can change. Learning to have that for myself has allowed me to live a life in a completely different way than when I was living in shame and trying to lie to myself and trying to shut down all of the deep, dark feelings that I had, because the reality is those are just as much a part of me as my good qualities and my light, palatable, creative, cool qualities. It's all me, and I've learned to accept all of it, and you can do the same thing. So that's my talk for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day. I'll see you on the next episode. Bye.